Hey, this is Tyler at NextFab. I'm here today to talk through 4 pro tips for sanding and finishing wood. First tip, in the lower grits, I'm talking 80 grit and 120 grit, there is the pencil line technique. So in order to assure yourself that you are sanding enough in the lower grits, something I like to do is just take a normal pencil and place a line, pretty heavy line, from edge to edge across my board. Now, graphite of the pencil will sit on the surface of the wood. It's not going to be soaking into the pores or the fibers. Unlike a Sharpie, you would never want to use a Sharpie for this. It sits right on top, and as you're going through and sanding, you sand until the pencil line disappears, and you know, since you put that line across the entire surface of the board, that you did a nice, even, consistent job of sanding the entire surface. There we go. All the pencil lines are removed. Now it takes a little bit of time, but I know now that I have a nice even scratch pattern across the surface. So you may have also noticed while I was sanding that a part of my board, the pencil lines disappeared early on, and the other half of my board, it took a little while for me to get them all removed. I didn't stop sanding the part where the pencil lines were already removed. You don't want to focus on one area more than the rest of the board. If you do, the area you focus on, the area you spend more time sanding, is going to get sanded away further. Sanding, after all, is a reductive act. So in order to maintain a consistent and even scratch pattern across the surface, I made sure to keep that sander moving across the entire surface evenly until all the pencil lines were removed. So for my second tip here, always remove the dust, but before you jump up to your next grit of sandpaper. There's a few reasons you want to do this. If there's dust remaining on the surface of your board, it's going to clog up the space between the abrasive on your sandpaper, causing it to be less effective. Essentially, it's just going to be creating more friction and slowing you down. You don't want that. So make sure that dust is removed. Another reason why you want to wipe the dust off the surface before moving up to a new grit is any of the abrasive from the lower grit that may have fallen off your sandpaper will just be sitting on the surface of the wood. You go up to that next grit without wiping the dust off, you're just going to mar the surface of your wood with that grit from the lower sandpaper that was left behind. What you're going to see are what we call pigtails or squiggles. Essentially, you'll see a little scratch that will go the length of your wood, much like this. They can be short, they can be long. Often you'll see them in streaks. That is because some of that abrasive was left behind when switching between grits, or you didn't spend enough time at a lower grit. So the pencil line technique will help make sure you're sanding long enough, and the wiping technique will make sure that these pigtails are not going to happen. All that abrasive and dust is taken away. Now for the 120 grit, you can use the pencil line technique, but moving into our 220 grit, 220 grit is the finest grit that we use while sanding wood before we apply our finishes. Some woodworkers argue about the finest grit. Some say 220, others say 180. It's really dependent on the hardness of your wood. Really hard woods don't really benefit from going all the way to 220 because it burnishes the surface more than continues that scratch pattern. So without doing the pencil technique, I will sand with my 220 grit just like I would everything else. Just nice even back and forth until it feels nice, flat, and consistent. And often you can actually see the difference. It becomes a little faded, a little cloudier. But that cloudiness clears up as soon as you apply your finish. All right, my third tip for you is raising the grain with water. So what I'm doing here, after I remove the dust, after I've sanded with my orbital sander to 220, I'm gonna spritz the surface with some water. But after it dries, I'm gonna go back without the orbital sander, but rather just a hand sander. I have this block here. You could just do it by hand if you don't have a block, that's fine. But when it fully dries, I just give it a quick once over, light pass. I'm not scratching the surface. All I'm doing is taking those little fibers that stood up on end and just knocking those away. The fourth tip I have for you is in line with raising the grain. It is called glue size. With the glue size, it's effectively the same thing, except glue size is made out of wood glue and water. It's about 1 part wood glue to 10 parts water, though you can change that as you see fit. What you do is you brush it on your mixture, your homemade mixture. You just brush it on all across the surface. You let it soak in, saturate the wood, and then you come through after it's soaked up a little bit. You want to come through and you want to remove any extra with a lint-free rag or paper towel. Now, what this is doing, it's essentially raising the grain, except this time it is hardening with the watered down glue, hardening those fibers in place. The other reason why you want to be using glue size is if you are staining your wood. Wood stain can be tricky to use. Wood stain can become blotchy. Now, blotchy wood stain is when you apply a stain to your wood where some areas are more absorbent than other areas, and more of that stain gets drawn in, and you get this blotchy, gross surface. It's uneven, it looks unnatural. Now, if you use a sealer like glue size, then it puts just sort of like a baseline coat. The wood is still porous because there wasn't enough glue in here to totally seal the surface, but it makes it consistent and even. So your finish is gonna go on more evenly, it's gonna look more consistent, it's gonna look nicer, especially if that pigment has stain in it. There are commercial products that you can buy that do effectively the same as wood sealer. There's a product called sanding sealer, and there's a few other products out there, but you really don't need to buy those. Essentially, you can just make your own out of wood glue and water. That's my fourth tip. All right, well, thanks everybody for watching. I hope you found one or more of these tips helpful. I'll catch you later.